Welcome to The Invisible Men. My name is Ian Rowe, Senior Fellow at the American Enterprise Institute and the founder of Vertex Partnership Academies, a public charter high school in the Bronx, New York.
I'm Nique Faziours, a member of the Leadership Network at AEI, as well as an adjunct professor at both Rice Business School and the WashU Olin Business School.
Nique, great to see you. You know, here in our podcast, The Invisible Men, it's all about uplifting some incredible men that, the larger community in the United States may not be, getting access to or aware of their work. And I got to say, we are very excited as a return guest, Dr. Will Reilly. Will, good to see you.
Thanks for having me on, gents. I'm inspired by you guys.
Well, you're the guest this time. So Dr. Will Reilly, Associate Professor of Political Science in Kentucky State University. Full disclosure, Will and I, we've done a bunch of things together. We've been on panels arguing against wokeness in K-12 education. We've done work together at 1776 Unites, and Will has written for Newsweek, Commentary, Tablet, Spike, Colette. His work is out there. And, Will, you've just become what I call like the debunker in chief. There are these myths out there that
these beloved myths, myths that he takes on. It's amazing.
Yes, that are taken as gospel. But you just take data and logic and reason and say, actually, if you look at the numbers, particularly around issues of race. And so you've now written a new book called Lies My Liberal Teacher Told Me.
Mm-hmm.
Why'd you write this book? Because I love there's a quote attributed at the very beginning, I think attributed to Mark Twain. It ain't what you don't know that gets you in trouble, youngster. It's what you know for sure that just ain't so. So why the book? Why the Mark Twain intro? Welcome.
Well, thank you, gents, for having me. I wasn't kidding when I said you guys inspire me. But in terms of the book, so one of the focuses of my writing has been looking at things that are really widely believed in kind of mainstream American, maybe upper middle class culture, but that just aren't real, and kind of trying to tear them apart because so many of them are negative creators of fear. And sometimes that's almost funny. I mean, so I remember reading a couple of years back, Kex TC, the big European consultancy, found that among at least upper middle class women, 9% of people thought that something like a tenth of the country had died of COVID. So we have the media constantly in our face, whether that's MSNBC or Fox, saying crazy things, and that has results. But a lot of this cuts a lot deeper. I mean, in one of my books, Taboo, I look at the claims of the Black Lives Matter movement, and that was very serious stuff. I mean, Ben Crump, who's probably America's leading lawyer, someone you'd see at serious events and so on, wrote a book with the extremely provocative title of Open Season, the Legalized Genocide of Colored People. And he argued that, tens of thousands of young Black men are being murdered annually by policemen and vigilantes and so on. There's no reason to sugarcoat what he said. And if you actually look at the statistics on police shooting, like on-duty killings of unarmed African-American men by American law enforcement officers, I mean, last year the total was 12. And after I and other people, Heather McDonald of the Manhattan Institute, Roland Fryer, invaluable over at Harvard, started researching this. I mean, the Washington Post actually put together a database. It's called The Counted. It's quite good. But they keep track from, I think, 2016 on of all these shootings year by year. And there's never been a year where, in terms of unarmed African Americans, it's more than 30 of these brothers that have been killed, I believe. Total police shootings in a year in the USA, by the way, 1,000 maybe across all races, all weapons categories. So the narrative just turned out to be completely unreal. 60 to 75% of the police shootings are of whites and Caucasian Hispanics. They're almost all provoked, so on down the line. So I often try to look at the actual data, which I know how to access as an academic professor, underlying some of the things we hear and see whether those claims are real, and they're often not. My latest book, as you
Right.
mentioned, is called Lies My Liberal Teacher Told Me. And it's a direct response to a book you guys may have read in college. I did. But Lies My Teacher Told Me by J period Lowen. And the idea of this book is they're kind of two ideas. Like, one is Western culture is really bad. This is the society that dispossessed the Indians and, held some of our ancestors as slaves, didn't let women vote until 100 years ago, and dropped big bombs on the East Asian countries and so on. But also, too, and we're dishonest about that because we teach from the right wing. These prejudiced white elites are the disseminators of information. And I think there are two problems with that. One is that Western culture isn't guilty of anything that every culture isn't guilty of. We need to be honest about history, but things like slavery were universal practices. I mean, until the adoption of modern Christianity and similar faiths, until the adoption of modern science, people were barbarians, and it's important to engage with that. I mean, slavery was just the penance for a lost war. Human nature is extremely predatory. So that's point one. You need to recognize that, be honest about that if you're going to teach history at all. But point two is that pointing out the flaws of the West isn't some brave, truth-telling enterprise that repressed rebels on the left are doing. They're the people that are in charge. And that's sort of the big lie that they're telling, right? That the center right is running everything in the country, and the feminists and the Kendys and the D'Angelos are bravely resisting them, knuckles up. In reality, those people have been the people controlling most things for a while. Like, the center of the Democratic Party is running the country. It's Joe Biden and Kamala Harris. So, I mean, I respond to the whole lies my teacher told genre by pointing out both of those things. Like, these are the people that are running education right now. And I look through the textbooks that we have in the schools now, and I ask, is what kids are learning any more honest than what they were learning in 1940? And I find out very often no. So I have whole chapters like Native Americans, were they peaceful? The Red Scare, was it a scare? Were there actually communists in the country? And so on down the line. Like, feminism,
Yep.
did it work out well for young women following the sexual revolution? Genders, how many are
Well,
there?
I want to dig into a couple of the chapters because I think some of them are just knock your socks off. Um, a few years ago, Shelby Steele and his son Eli Steele made a film called "What Killed Michael Brown,"
Yes.
and it was all about the actual story of what had unfolded with the officer and hands up, don't shoot, and all these things that turned out not to be true. But Shelby Steele used this phrase of a poetic truth that basically the poetic truth, sort of mangled the truth in such a way that it fits with the narrative, right? It kind of just falls into this idea of we're in a country that is oppressive, that is rigged against certain kinds of people. Why do you think that persists? I mean, there must be some value to it, right? There must be these myths, these poetic truths are sustained. Why?
Well, I think one reason that the kind of Kendi univariate argument, like racism explains everything, is so tempting, is that there really are gaping disparities in American society, and it's hard, it's awkward to pin them on anything else. So, I mean, in the case of the Black community, we know that bad things were done to Black people in the USA. And when we look at the Black community today and we see things like an out of wedlock birth rate of 60 to 70%, the simplest answer, if you think you're a decent person, is, well, look at what we did to these poor people. Slavery and Jim Crow and so on. How can we ever apologize enough? Now, the reality is that not long after slavery, I mean, before World War II, people like Walter Williams have pointed out that the out of wedlock birth rate in the African American community was 11%. So in reality, the problem doesn't have much of anything to do with at least contemporary racism. But I think that's why it's so tempting. Like if once you say, well, this clearly isn't really related to past ethnic conflict. It's related to, I don't think it's genetics certainly, but it's related to culture. It's related to welfare. It's related to, like I said, I talk about feminism and the sexual revolution in one of my chapters. It's related to all these things that we've been trained to see as good, or at least as really difficult to challenge. Then you're kind of in a fight. Like no one wants to step up and, write an op-ed criticizing single motherhood in New York or Chicago. So it's just the thing that you fall back on, like, oh, it's that old devil. The problem is that it's not, I think, but that's a very, very tempting hypothesis.
Will, I'm sure you remember several years ago, First Lady Michelle Obama was talking about her daughters, and she said one of her great concerns was that they might get pulled over by the police if they were playing their music too loud, and what could happen next. Do you think she really believes that?
Well, I kind of do. I mean, so first of all, what would happen if Sasha or Malia Obama was pulled over by the police is that their Secret Service detail would get out of the car and tell the DC officer to move on or get shot. I mean, like, as I understand, the presidential family is protected for like 12 years after the presidency. So let's be real with this. Or, the Harvard yard. I mean, anyway. But so I do think, though, that like in practice, like one level down from Sasha and Malia, I think that people really do feel this way. And again, it's hard to believe because it's so idiotic. Again, like the total number of unarmed Black people that were shot by police in the most recent year, like it's important to just keep hammering this into successful Black people's heads, was 12. How many interactions were there between citizens and police? About 60 million. I mean, people call the cops.
Right, but I've heard you share data about what the perception is.
Oh yeah,
of what the perception of the death, but based on the political affiliation of the people. Can you share some of that data?
Oh yeah, so there's a great small boutique think tank called the Skeptic Research Center, and they've actually started asking people all these fascinating questions about kind of unique topics. And one of them was, how many unarmed Black men do you think are killed by the police? Which no one else is really going to ask. And for Black men and urban white men, it was like among people who were it was like liberal and very liberal. They didn't ask leftists, they didn't ask Marxists, it was liberal people. But for very liberals, it was, I could actually pull it up here, but I mean, I actually just know it offhand. It was like, so about 30%, as I recall, thought it was more than 1,000 unarmed Black people were shot every year by the police. 14 to 15% thought it was more than 10,000, and 8% thought it was more than that. So, like, to put that in context, what I usually say as a reminder is that there are only about 20,000 murders in a year. And we're overrepresented, but usually less than half of those involve Black people. So there are a lot of people that think there are as many police shootings as there are murders. And that puts the level of fear that you see from so many people kind of in context right there. So like when someone like one of the Obamas says something like that, I do think they are coming from that perspective. Like they might feel a little more protected. But who are some other people that have said insane, dumb crap recently? Like LeBron James, I think really believes this. Like, I mean, I think he probably spray painted his own house in terms of some of the fake hate crimes we've seen. Like, big racial slurs on the gate, like after the championship. But I mean,
but this is the poetic truth, right? It's, who does it serve for most of America to think that more than 10,000 Black men are killed by police each year? Who does that serve?
Well, it doesn't serve anybody. This is the problem. So there's actually a deep point here. Like, this is the problem with becoming unethical in general. So the idea of like the unethical, the gray man in war and so on is like, I'm torturing, killing, raping because I'm pursuing the good. I'm helping my country, whatever. If it turns out that your cause was the wrong one, you've still tortured and killed and raped all those people. I mean, that's why we eventually move toward a virtue ethics, toward making certain things just illegal. Because everyone feels their cause is just, and only half of them can be correct at best, whereas certain things are just evil. I mean, the Israel-Palestine war comes to mind in terms of, some of this back and forth. Like, no matter who's correct, all those people from October 7th are still dead. So, I mean, at a lesser level, I guess what I'm getting at here is the reason for the poetic truth and the fake hate crime is that the person doing these things feels that the problem in the USA really is racial oppression. And they feel that by calling attention to racial oppression, they'll help reduce the real problem in the USA, which is, RI.
Even if it's not true. Even if it's not true.
But that's the problem.
Right?
It's not true. They think it is, but it isn't. Like, the problem in LeBron James's life is it's not oppression at all, actually. Even if you're good at Marxist analysis, LeBron James is a lord. Like, he's a member of the upper bourgeoisie. He just doesn't know that for some reason. But I mean, this actually has effects. Like, LeBron's focus on this one thing, like, we need to totally get rid of any vestige of microaggression level racism, has actually caused him to ignore other things that are really causing problems in the Black community. Like, LeBron James is running a school, and none of the kids at the school can do math at grade level. There's a lot of exercise. I mean, there's a lot of exercises about racial identity, and for a Black school, there's a lot of gay pride stuff. I've looked into the school, but there's not a lot of sitting down with books and reading them. So he's really disadvantaging a lot of young Black men, and this is unfortunate. It's the artificial distracting from the real, sort of.
Well, I want to go back to Michelle Obama just for a minute, because I want you to give us counsel on this.
Okay.
She is Princeton graduate, Harvard Law School graduate, a former senior executive at the University of Chicago, the First Lady of America. Why does she not think that that's not a possibility for every Black girl in America?
That's a great question. This, to me, is a real contradiction. So, I mean, it's the same thing with Kamala Harris and a lot of the former sorors and Black businesswomen around her. I mean, objectively speaking, like, the leading contender for the presidency is Black and Asian American. She went to Howard. You can say, well, there's still some racism in the business world. We've all seen it. But that implies that there's a pretty open field out there in front of you. So how do you, on the one hand, say, like, yeah, I'm not going to make the noise, but I mean, like, how can you say, yeah, my sister's gonna make it, gonna be the president, and then in the same sentence almost say, well, this is still this desolate land, the land of strange fruit and all that. I think that most people manage to rationalize this by coming up with this almost Harry Potter hero narrative. I actually see white women do this more than Black people. But like the whole The Resistance thing, where people were putting the blue waves on their social media profiles and were walking around in COVID masks for 2 years, and the leftists in the red states are joining John Brown gun clubs and so on. I think there are a lot of people that really do see the country as divided between brave heroes that are comfortable with diversity and almost Nazi Klansmen. And if you talk to one of the Nazi Klansmen, you might get infected with their Nazism. And that was one of the things that led to cancel culture. The idea that there were these very mainstream ideas, like there are only two sexes, Black people aren't oppressed, that were too dangerous to be uttered in public. These things that had to be cast out. We've just come out of about 3 years of people kneeling to preppy Black women on college campuses and wearing kente cloth in Congress and so on. So I think that the contradiction you guys identified is very real. And I think the way people resolve it is by saying, I'm a heroic warrior and I'm on the side of the 52% of the country that fights for the light. Those other people, they're evil. That's how stuff like January 6th, which was a bad, embarrassing riot, but that's how that becomes like we almost lost our society.
Yep. I mean, the president of the United States, Barack Obama, said he was Trayvon Martin.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, here's this horrible event. And rather than say this was an exception, here's what's possible, he puts himself on a level playing field to this kid.
Yeah. And I think that one of the things that I'm kind of thankful for, whether it's for actually growing up in the hood for a while, so being able to look at this from the outside, because this is mostly a middle class on up panic, or having diverse friends, people from different countries, Japan, Nigeria, and so on, who are just totally impatient with this, no tolerance for it at all. But I mean, like, when you recognize that a lot of this isn't real, it kind of becomes, it starts to look crazy. And this is true for a lot of things. Like I don't just mean to keep going on about the man woman stuff, but like the feminist and men's rights argument that like differences between the sexes are socially conditioned. So like men and women would be equally strong if they did more training, this kind of thing. Men would be as empathic as women. Like, bro, even the men's rights, like many rapists are female. Shut up. This is not true. The racial stuff is often almost at that level. So like Barack Obama, when he said, my son, it was something like look and act like Trayvon. Like my son would be just like Trayvon, indistinguishable from Trayvon, that famous speech. No, he wouldn't. There's a 0% chance that Barack Obama's young boy would be walking around at 2 a.m. in the morning, wearing a hooded sweatshirt, picking up the purple Skittles and Sprite and all that other crap, getting in a fight with a Hispanic security guard in the hood. I mean, there's a 0% chance that happens. There is a null probability. It's not going to occur. Obama said that because he'd kind of learned, he's Kenyan and white, but he'd kind of learned a certain sort of black culture where that's the norm. That's the thing you're supposed to say. It could have been any of us. I could have just been going to church. And one final quick comment. In the book Taboo, I actually looked at the black police shooting cases like in depth for a year or two. Police killing cases. I guess Freddie Gray wasn't a shooting. Some of them were really questionable. Some of them did make me a bit angry as a black man. But one thing that was notable was that none of them involved a normal black guy going on a date or going to church or going to play basketball. Like none of them. Like my caveat was, are any of these like a normal citizen who happens to be black, who's not a felon, not a 2-time previous felon, who's not fighting the police or committing a felony.
Right, who wasn't resisting arrest or, yeah.
Yeah, like whether or not you think that should be a felony, but who wasn't resisting arrest, fighting the cops, where things escalated, who was just gunned down. And there are two that might stand out, Tamir Rice and Walter Scott, but other than that, out of hundreds, and those weren't in the year I looked at, other than that, out of hundreds, none. They were all people where the best defense would be, yeah, that guy was a scumbag. He was probably a pedophile. He had a gun on him. I'm thinking of Elton Sterling here. But, you know, the cops used too much force on his neck. And it kind of gets you into almost, you know, Bill Cosby or Dr. Umar land, where it's sort of like, okay, but why was he doing this stuff in the first place? I guess is the question.
Mm-hmm. Well, Will, you may remember we have something that we call the speed round. We did this with you in your first episode with us. So I'm just going to throw out some people or an idea and just ask you to pick one and give us the reason why. So I'll start with Tucker Carlson or Joe Rogan.
Joe Rogan. I like them both as guys. I think Joe Rogan is the broader interviewer. Tucker Carlson's kind of a man of the right. Joe Rogan can interview people about like vegan sushi. No offense to Tucker, who I consider a casual friend, but Joe Rogan.
And so I recently pulled a book out of my library written by a guy named Keith Richburg. I don't know if you remember him, but the book was, okay, great. The book Out of America, A Black Man Confronts Africa. And one of the core statements that he had in his book that triggered a lot of blowback and a lot of discussion was he basically said he was thankful that his ancestors were brought to America as slaves, as it allowed him to be born in the United States versus Africa. You agree with his position or not?
Yeah, I mean, it's like this is something that just like, you know, we as white or black Americans, you know, we don't talk that much about colonialism, but both Indian and British people will spar with each other about it. This is something that in the black community we used to say pretty often, like Muhammad Ali, thank God my daddy got on that boat when he went to Ghana and he saw an African slum, you know. And, you know, a lot of my friends are from Mexico, Jamaica, so on. Like, if you went to Ciudad de Mexico or to Trench Town or something, I mean, it's developed compared to a great deal of, say, Congo, but I think you'd probably come back with a new appreciation for the south side of Chicago. So, yes is the answer. That's Keith Richburg's Out of America. And I think there's a key point here about reparations, actually, which is obviously slaves, who were mostly African warriors and their families who lost basically to Benin or the Ashanti, these medieval level civilized black kingdoms. I mean, there were sizable states in Africa, and got on that boat and came over here. They were victimized by slavery. If you were a banner captain of the Nadabele people and then all of a sudden you were a slave, your life got worse. But none of us have ever been slaves. You guys, as I recall, went to Harvard. I mean, I went to Illinois for law school. I didn't suffer that much. So none of us have ever experienced serfdom. So when you're looking at us and you're asking where should reparations come from if you're an Ivy League or Big Ten or Pac-10 or whatever Patriot League graduate, the argument has to be you are worse off than you would be had the ancestors remained in Africa, basically. There's a punishment that you have endured as a result of being here. I think that's a very difficult argument to make. Like, I think had the old wars not happened, Africa would be more developed today. There'd be fewer people taken from there. But in all likelihood, the three of us would be slightly to dramatically worse off in some Nigerian community. I mean, I think that's the reality. I'd be a lawyer in Abuja. So it's that's a gold merchant. Probably we'd still be 200 years behind the developmental curve, and none of the fighting happened. So yeah, I largely agree with Richburg. It's just something you're not supposed to say. TM.
Very good, thank you.
So, given what you just said, one of the other myths I love when you talk about it, when we talk about the racial wealth gap, you talk about the ethnic groups that have the greatest wealth in this country.
Yes.
Right? Nigerian Americans, Ghanaian Americans, Indian Americans. What does that say? What does that say about what the Black experience is?
Well, it says that America today is a pretty fair competition. I think a lot of Black people, and Caribbeans are doing very well as well, by the way, but a lot of Black people should stop kind of looking at their shoes and thinking about the past. True for a lot of poor whites too, Appalachians, Irishmen. I mean, people that are 80% white in the Southwest but identify as Native. There are a lot of Caucasian groups that are at the lower end of that earnings scale. We should talk about them as well. But unsuccessful groups in the USA right now tend to be groups very much focused on fighting each other in the past. The successful groups in the United States tend to be first through fifth generation immigrants focused on succeeding in the now. So those African immigrant groups you mentioned are in general doing as well as or slightly better than whites. Asian immigrant groups are doing even better. So the richest group in the USA is Indian Americans, who are beating Jewish Americans. I mean, the average Indian household has a wealth of it's an annual income of $140,000. Wealth, I believe, is more substantial than that. So, I mean, that's doing quite well. I might need to briefly plug in a computer here. That should take 1 second. Oh, that should take 1 second. But I'm gonna turn off my camera for a second. Come back in 20.
There you go. I mean, what he's saying is right, Nique. It's just, there's often this thing, it's skin color, which is the determinant. And then this is what Will does so well. He debunks myths. It's like, okay, well, if skin color is the thing, what is it that explains Indian Americans, Nigerian Americans, and by the way, African Americans, people who were born and raised in the United States, and some segment is also successful. And so you start to realize maybe it's about the behaviors, the practices, not necessarily the skin color.
For sure.
Yeah, there was a message I got online. Obviously, it's condensation of an academic article, but it was from the group Free Black Thought, interesting online journal. But it was just sort of a, will you help me share this? And of course I did. But what they were doing was looking at the poverty statistics for Black Americans. They're fairly high, 17% or whatever it was. But the poverty statistic for Black people in two-parent, stably married families was 5.62%. And it was lower than it was this year for whites. And we were all cheering that a little bit. Although,
wow.
Their rates were quite low too, 7%. But if you're looking at racism, a bigot, when you go apply for a job, has no way of understanding that you're a married man, go to church, this sort of thing. It's something that's part of who you are, but it's not visible. So those kind of effects are entirely internal. They don't have anything to do with the external world. They have to do with who you've developed yourself into as a competitor and as a person. And I find that to be a lot more important.
100%. Now, Will, we definitely can't end this podcast without getting your perspective on the recent admissions rate numbers that MIT published post race-based admissions. Because in our last conversation with you shared, I think, some really important perspective about some of the really limiting factors associated with traditional affirmative action. So, just for the audience, and Ian, keep me honest, but this year, African Americans are making up 5% of MIT's entering population. Prior year, it was 13%. So a drop of 8 full points.
Well, and which community went up in percent? Asian Americans.
6%.
Yeah, so it's important to note where that population shift occurred.
Yeah, the funny thing about that is that whites went down a point or two, as I recall. Like, you guys might correct me, but like all the conservative white guys that are talking all this about, like, yeah, get rid of that affirmative action and our kids will be going to Harvard. I mean, I'm on the right on a lot of issues, but like, you don't know, man. The Ghanaians are coming for you. Like, at least in the top schools. So first of all, I don't think that MIT is notably less diverse now. It was African Americans went from 13% to 5 or 6%, and I'm proud of these kids. Like, there were almost no advantages there now. So like 5% minimum of the people that got in were just black. There was a lot of talk online about this will be 1%. No, people boned up. They studied for the test. They did much better, 500% better than predicted. I'm extremely glad to see that. That's, I think, what you're going to see. And when I say I'm a culturalist on IQ, that's what that means. If you can improve your board scores by 500%, at least in terms of representation, in a year, that implies that there was something going on, that there was a ball and chain effect of all these programs where kids would just say, I know I've got a 200-point edge. I'm going to try out for the basketball team. And that's a perfectly rational thing to do. But so 5% black or a little bit more, 11% Hispanic, same 40% white, and then almost 50% Asian, 47% Asian American. So when people say that's not diverse, you'd have to explain to me what you mean by that, especially since, probably statistically about half the white kids would be Jewish and Arab American if you look at who's scoring well on math tests in that white group. So I'm glad to see those results. It's unfortunate that there are fewer African Americans, but that's what the test produced. It still obviously looks like one of the most diverse schools in the world, and now everyone deserves to be there. And where did the black and Hispanic kids that got cut, because it used to be 18% Hispanic, where did they go? Michigan. That's one of the things about this. Like, if you get rejected from Harvard, you don't wind up cleaning toilets. It's you go to Duke. So I think that this is this whole thing of, I applied to Illinois and Yale, both of which for law schools are like top 15. Yale's usually in the top 14, which is where you want to go. Always in the top 14, which is where you want to go for law school. But then I applied to just a bunch of random schools, and I got into basically the Yale waitlist to me, but I got into the top 2, and then I got into one of the poor ones. It's hard to project for law school. But the point is that, like, had I gone to whatever it was, I think Ohio, but I just would have been a lawyer in the Midwest. I would have been okay. So it's the same thing at a higher level for the people that are currently not going to be attending their first choice.
Right.
And they also have a better chance of graduating, by the way, getting to the point.
Right. And in addition to that, look, let's say you're upset that only 5% of the incoming class at MIT is black kids.
Yep.
The issue is not that someone may be upset with that. The issue is what they choose to do to try and rectify it.
Yeah.
Right. So you could either say 5%, okay, we need to create some artificial measures so that we can ensure we get that number to 12%, right? A cosmetic change. As opposed to, how do we improve the quality of the K-12 system so that more talented kids of all races are now able to compete on a level playing field, right? So it's not the disparity that we should be all upset about, in the sense of, look, everyone should have opportunity, but in a limited applicant pool, not everyone can get a seat. It's how you choose to rectify the problem.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
And I don't think American schools are terrible by global standards, but I mean, last year, and Ian, you're one of the people that I first heard say this because there's so much sort of alt-right versus pro-black discussion online, and even, I mean, short of the top journals, even in the press, basically. But so there's a lot of this, like the black kids are failing. You in one of your speeches pointed out, no, like all the kids are failing. Like if you accept,
White kids can't read either. The majority of white kids can't read either.
No, that's right. If you accept something like proficient, not below basic, not the stuff we've gotten used to. If you accept proficient as the standard, that's what you want. 54% of white kids last year did not meet that. 76% of Hispanics, and I think 82% of blacks. So the vast majority of the people can't read. Asians, I think, do about as well as whites on reading. They're better on math. So 55% of them or something can't read. So you're not. There's nobody that's performing well. And I mean, that's the situation that you're starting with. So when you ask, well, how can I make my group do better or the country do better? It's not hard to improve on a 55% failure rate, I'd imagine. Correct. I haven't had a problem like that in business or academia, but I like to think that if I had one, you'd move toward a 50% failure rate. You'd do something. We'll see.
We'll see. All right, Dr. Will Reilly, as always, a pleasure. But we can't let you leave without one little tidbit of advice that we'd like for you to share.
Okay.
As I think our listeners know, Nique and I started this podcast 30 plus years ago. Well, it was back of a documentary when we were at Harvard Business School together, and Rodney King, the Los Angeles motorist, had been beaten, and the video of it went viral. The police officers were acquitted, and riots all over the country. And this narrative of black men being this endangered species, that the system is rigged against you. And we made a documentary 30 plus years ago where we got the different black men from Harvard Graduate School to provide advice to Daryl. Daryl, the 16-year-old black kid from forgotten USA. And we just felt Daryl was just being fed a steady diet of you're oppressed. This society is against you. You're an endangered species. And we felt that Daryl wasn't seeing black men like us or black men like you. Fast forward, George Floyd, Michael Brown. Once again, there's like this subcurrent of young black men just don't have a shot in this society. So in some of your parting words, Dr. Reilly, what would you tell Daryl? What would you tell a 16-year-old kid from forgotten USA, a black kid who's trying to make sense of the world for himself?
Yeah, so I think there are two things there. One is almost before what I'd tell Daryl. Something that's really striking is how little's changed in the race relations conversation. So, I mean, like you could take a lot of those reactions to Rodney King, a lot of those reactions to O.J. Simpson, blacks and whites knocking each other over the head, people telling crazy lies about rates of risk. And you could fast forward those 20, 22 years to George Floyd and Jacob Blake, and nothing would have changed. Like people primarily, but not entirely black, sort of enumeratively saying the other man's trying to kill me, like very little would have changed at all. And that's actually kind of depressing. So that's one point. And I guess a follow-up there would be that that's not true. That's something that's very important. I mean, Rodney King was a complete outlier. He's a motorist on PCP, breezed by the cops at 115 miles an hour. Beating was way over the line, but he fought them for 3 minutes before the final portion where he got his ass kicked. One of the things that nobody knows about Rodney King was that there were 3 other employed black men in the car with him that night who didn't get touched at all. That's just one of those things. There were literally guys just sitting by the side of the road watching this brawl and sort of thinking like, good God, stop.
Wow. I did not know that.
Yeah, the cops didn't touch him. They didn't touch the cops. It was just one of those like, our boy's going ham. He's probably going to prison. I mean, it was just, there's one of the cops, I think it was the Hispanic guy, wrote a book about this. And he was just like, it was really unfortunate. Like, we obviously knew this was going to badly affect our careers. These guys are obviously terrified. They were fighting the 6'4" guys on PCP. It's just one of those things. I imagine the George Floyd officers, if they ever speak publicly, will say something very similar. Like, what do you do in a case like this, where it's this war level of tension? where there's a guy who's a repeat felon, he's an armed robber, he's clearly dying, but do you let him up? There's a mob around you. He's a foot bigger than you. What do you do? And you like to think you'd make a better decision than those guys did. Resulted in a man's death, of course, but it's not racism from the entire country that came together to murder this brother. So, but anyway, what would I tell Daryl in the context of this unchanging, somewhat depressing picture? I would tell Daryl to use his eyes to some extent. Like, and this is advice I often give people in sort of the gender debate and this kind of thing. You know, are there more than two sexes? However people may want to live their lives. But like, look around. You know, when you say forgotten USA, I'd imagine a typical town of 50,000 just outside Lexington, Kentucky. Daryl's probably in an interracial relationship. Daryl's probably trying out for the varsity. You know, I mean, like, do people seem to be ravening bigots? You know, in your off-season job in Foot Locker, do your customers seem to hate you? Do they seem to hate Black people? Do you have any trouble when it comes to going to school? Do your teammates dislike you? Do your classmates dislike you? Do you dislike white people? I mean, like, how hard would you say that it's going to be to apply to, you know, the University of North Carolina? Do you foresee yourself getting rejected? I mean, and as you ask those questions, and this is the same advice I give a lot of different people, actually, when they start saying that all Black people are criminals, which is becoming more common online, or all men are rapists, all women are gold digging prostitutes, all this sort of nonsense. Is that real? Think of 20 people around you. Do any of them fit that bill? You know, are you talking about the majority of the outgroup, or are you talking about one person in 50 who we all agree should be in jail? But anyway, I would ask Daryl to use his eyes, look at the world, see whether it fits what he's being told, and if not, why might people be telling him that?
Excellent. Lead with your eyes. Well, Dr. Will Reilly, thank you for joining us on this episode of The Invisible Men. We love to create a platform for someone, especially like you, who is going after these myths, these beloved myths, as Nique says.
Thank you for having me.
Just telling the truth. Thank you.